Hi, I'm Maggie. Thank you for stopping by Crafts the Charm today. I'm so glad you're here. Last December, I made a series of videos which was a Big Thunder Mountain Railroad themed tree. And what I've done is I've compiled all those videos into one video here for you so you can see all of the ornaments and the box and the topper in one video. And I've put chapters in so you can jump to whichever craft interests you. The great thing about a themed tree is they are really fun, but if you don't want an entire themed tree, you can pick and choose among the ornaments. I hope you enjoy this compilation of the Big Thunder Mountain Railroad themed tree. Let's get right into it.
So I want to make little kerosene lanterns, such as what you might find in a mine. And what can you use to make little kerosene lanterns? Well, what I have here is some finger shooters, which are sort of like tiny little foam noodles. I have some craft foam. I have some flip-flops, and I was really excited to find these little glass jars because that was the part that I was most worried about, is what would I use for the glass part of the lantern. Now, these finger shooters have these wings on them, and when I took them off, I realized that these little pieces of foam would probably be perfect for those side pieces on a lantern. You could, of course, just use any regular craft foam if you didn't have enough of these, or if you don't have the finger shooters. So the finger shooters are basically the perfect size for the little glass jar to fit inside. So if you just cut off a slice of the finger shooter, you can stick the little glass jar inside. Now, the very first lantern that I make mostly from the finger shooter. So I cut off one piece of the finger shooter for the bottom to insert the glass into, and one piece for the top, but I wanted the top to be a little bit smaller, so I decided to sort of squish it together and glue it with hot glue. I'm working from a kerosene lamp that I found in my home, and I have no idea where this thing came from. It started out purple, but I thought that it would be a great decor piece to go with this tree, so I painted it a sort of oil-rubbed bronze by painting it black, and then dabbing on a sort of a bronze color of paint. Now I'm working from that as sort of a model. I'm not going to make, obviously, a tiny little replica of it, but I'm trying to get as close as I can. So I'm going to use a compass to make circles for some of the larger pieces, like so for the base, for below that finger shooter piece, and then between top pieces. So just sort of estimating with a compass a good size for that, and then tracing it on the piece of craft foam and cutting it out. Now, unfortunately, I could only get a thin piece of craft foam. My local Joann's is going to be closing down and opening up a store in another location, so they haven't been restocking, at least that's what they told me, and they didn't have any thick craft foam, but I thought I could make do with the thin craft foam here. In fact, I decided this would be the perfect application for the flip-flop. So instead of using a nice thick craft foam, I'm using the flip-flop as thick craft foam. And I'm really not sure what the flip-flop is made out of as compared with craft foam. It seems to be, a little bit more rubbery than craft foam. So I'm sure it's not exactly the same material. So I cut a round piece out of the craft foam to build up the base, and I just used a box cutter knife for that. It doesn't cut super neatly, but it is relatively easy to cut with the box cutter knife, and you can also sort of finish that off with scissors. I tried to sort of bevel it with scissors once I had cut it with the knife, but if you keep watching, you'll see I found a much better technique for cutting this. So what I have is a disc of craft foam at the bottom, and then a disc of flip-flop, and then I guess a disc, you would say, but it's, fairly thick, of the finger shooter, which I can insert the glass jar into. And then on top of that, I have another piece of the finger shooter, which is rolled up and hot glued together to make it a little bit smaller. And around that, sort of bisecting it in the middle, I've put another very thin piece of finger shooter, so that makes it look almost like it has a little hat. And all of this will hot glue together very nicely. one thing to be cautious of with the hot glue is the finger shooter, which is made of some kind of foam, which is sort of like pool noodle foam, will melt if you put the hot glue gun on it directly, or perhaps if your hot glue is very hot. I'm using a low temperature hot glue gun, so I was able to use that where I wanted to use it, but as long as I kept it far enough away from the foam, I could just plain glue it by dropping glue onto it. Now, using the little wings, I sort of measured just by holding them against my faux lantern here. Put the glass in when you're doing this, of course. I figured out sort of where I wanted it to attach, and then just cut it out, cut out the middle of it, and made a sort of a handle for each side. And now when I'm gluing the handles on, this is when I took advantage of the hot glue gun's ability to eat into the foam. So I wanted those to not be stuck on the outside because I was afraid that wouldn't be strong enough. So I did eat into the foam a little bit by just pressing the hot glue gun against it and then filling that with hot glue, and then I could insert that handle into the foam. Now, with it mostly assembled, everything except the handles attached to the top, I decided to paint it, and of course you're going to take the glass out to do this. We do want to make sure that the parts of it that will be visible through the glass, so the little inner parts, are also painted. And I'm going to paint this using an effect that will make it look like galvanized steel. I didn't want to paint them black because I was afraid that wouldn't show up well against a Christmas tree. But you could, of course, paint it any color you like. You could paint it copper or black, or you could paint it a brighter color. I wanted to go for that sort of Old West, sort of mine look. So I'm starting by painting the whole thing a shade of gray. And I'm just using apple barrel acrylic paints here in white and black, and mixing up a gray color to give it a first coat of gray. With this painting technique, you're going to paint all of the surfaces gray and let that gray paint dry. And you can see that all of the surfaces take the acrylic paint pretty well. The surface that's the hardest to paint is that finger shooter, which is like the foam noodle foam. It is quite absorbent and it maintains its texture. Now, once that coat of gray paint has dried completely, we're going to do the technique to make it look like galvanized steel or galvanized tin. And to do that, I'm going to use, again, the apple barrel acrylic black paint. And I'm also going to use a metallic silver paint. Now, the one that I have here that I've used before with good success is called metallic pewter, and it's by Handmade Modern. And I think I may have gotten it at Target, but I'm not sure. And what you're going to do is dry brush these on, and you're going to begin with the metallic silver color, so in this case metallic pewter, and then you're going to do the black, and then you're going to finish with the metallic pewter. And you can do this while they're still wet. Because you're dry brushing them, they're not going to be super wet, but you don't have to wait for the coats to dry. Now, I'm using one paintbrush here, but I found that this worked better, that I got a less muddy result if I used two paintbrushes, one for each color, and I was fairly careful not to mix the paints as best as I could. I also found, very near to the end of this entire project, that this technique seems to look better if you brush more than dab. So I'm doing it almost like I'm stenciling here by dabbing, but I found that just sort of lightly brushing and really dry brushing, getting a lot of the paint off the brush before you do this. But brushing it more than dabbing it seemed to give a result that looked more like galvanized tin or steel to me. And if you look at galvanized tin or steel, you can see that it's sort of patchy looking, not dotty looking. So I think this makes sense that you want to brush it. And now with that all dry, I used this black florist wire that I bought at the Dollar Tree to make a little hanger, and I pushed that through the top of the piece. I then inserted the glass jar and I glued the handles to the top. Now I wanted to do something for the wire that goes across the glass part of the lantern. So the little cage that encloses the glass, I imagine, to help protect it, but I'm not sure exactly, maybe to hold it in place. And the wire was really too thin. That's a very thin gauge wire. So I thought I would try this black twine from the Dollar Tree. And we're going to call this prototype number, it's actually prototype number 2 of the lanterns. At the very end, I'll show you prototype number 1, which was pretty much a complete disaster. But this is not what I ended up using in the end, but you can look at it and see what you think of this. Maybe a silver color or a white color would look better than this black color. I think the black is just too black, but otherwise I don't think it would be too bad to use twine for this. And so I basically just put that on in an X pattern and just held it with a little bit of hot glue at the top and the bottom. And again, we're going to call that prototype 2, and this is what it looks like. And I don't love it, but it's close enough that I think, okay, if I keep going but make a few modifications, I think we can come up with a lantern that's going to look pretty authentic. So for my second attempt, or third, depending on how you count them, I first watched a YouTube video on how to cut craft foam, and this video, I will link it in the description below. This video is by a cosplayer, and cosplayers really know how to work with craft foam. I've actually used it myself. I made a Zelda costume once, not for myself, for somebody else, and craft foam was wonderful for making the armor, and it looks really cool. So cosplayers really know how to work with craft foam. And what I learned was, first of all, have a very sharp knife. So what I did was I didn't actually have to replace my blade, I just had to turn it around on the knife. And then you can cut at a bevel, but what I need to do is actually make the cut at an angle with the knife. So I did that. So you can see I have a nice beveled piece of flip-flop here, but it's very, very messy. So the other thing, the third thing that I learned from the cosplayer is that you can use a Dremel to clean off the edges. And I don't know why that didn't occur to me, but I'm very glad I watched the video. So I did take this outside with a respirator on, and that is what the cosplayer suggested in the video. And I'm always in favor of being as safe as possible. So I did take it outside with a respirator and I sanded the edges. So with the Dremel, I had it on the very lowest speed, and I tried both sort of going in the same direction that the Dremel was spinning and going against the direction that the Dremel was spinning. I didn't find that either of those worked particularly better than the other, but what I would say is you want to be very careful to touch it only very lightly to your flip-flop and just go very, very slowly, just a little bit at a time, because if you try to get aggressive, you might accidentally push a little too hard and make a sort of a divot, and you don't want that. Now, just to see if it worked, I also brought out a piece of the finger shooter, which again is sort of like pool noodle foam, and that does not sand well with the Dremel at all, so you're going to have to rely on scissors, I think, to shape the pool noodle foam. So continuing with the new version of the foam lantern, it has a slightly different structure from the one that I created before. So with this one, I have a ring of foam, and then on top of that, I have the beveled flip-flop. And then on top of that, I have a piece of the finger shooter. And sometimes the finger shooter inside hole is very small, sometimes it's larger. You can just trim out the inside of that to make the hole big enough to insert the glass jar in. To soften the seam between the piece of foam on the bottom and the flip-flop, and then also between the flip-flop and the piece of finger shooter, what I did was I used that twine and just glued it right in the seam. It gives another little bump there, so I think it gives it more shape, it makes it seem a little more realistic, and it helps soften, as I said, that seam between the two pieces. So just, it doesn't have to be the black twine, it can be any piece of string or twine, but gluing that around, I feel, made a really big difference in this lantern. Now on the top, instead of using the finger shooter like I had used before, I used just craft foam. So I cut thin strips of craft foam and just made them into a circle by attaching the ends, and I just used hot glue for that. And then to make it look like a little hat, you know, to have that sort of piece that bisected it before, I just cut a circle out of the craft foam and put that between the two little tubes. Now, I did try to use super glue instead of hot glue because I had seen another video which said that you could connect craft foam with super glue. I wasn't able to do it. I feel like if you could do it, it would potentially be neater than the hot glue because it is hard to make a very thin bead of hot glue, but I wasn't able to get that to work. But if you can use super glue, then certainly use the super glue. I think it would be neater. Now I also tried to cut a little hole in the top piece because my model kerosene lantern that I'm using has holes in the top pieces, I imagine, you know, to let smoke out or whatever. So I did try cutting a little hole in this, and that definitely would have been easier when the piece was flat. That would have been the time to do that. And again, I cut the wings as before, and I cut them so that they would connect from the finger shooter piece up to the top lantern piece. So the piece over the little hat brim circle. And again, with the foam, I did melt a little hole in the foam with the hot glue gun, and then fill it with glue and insert the little side piece, the little arm. Now, I decided that with it all assembled, but of course without the glass, I would try spraying a coat of Flex Seal on it. I just felt like the Flex Seal would keep it held together a little bit better, so I thought I would try it. I also added a little bit of hot glue where I felt like it wasn't completely flat or smooth in places that it should be. I then painted it using the exact same painting technique as before. Gray paint, completely dried, followed by dry brushing on pewter paint, black paint, pewter paint, in that order. And once that was done, I felt that it looked good enough that I sealed it with matte Mod Podge. So just a coat of matte Mod Podge over the entire surface, except of course the glass. Now for this one, instead of using the black twine, I found this 18 gauge steel wire, and I would recommend using a wire that's easier to bend. This is some pretty sturdy wire, and I had bought some very inexpensive wire that looked very similar to this, but that broke really easily and bent really easily. And I had bought it hoping to use it in my yard, but it wasn't strong enough, and then I think I gave it to Mr. Crafts the Charm for a project of his, so I don't have it anymore. But it was inexpensive. I can't remember if it was tin wire. Does that make sense? I can't remember what it was, so I got it at Home Depot. And I would recommend that for this because this doesn't need to have strength, and this steel wire is a little hard to bend, but it looks so much better than the black twine because it matches the galvanized steel look of the little lantern. So this is what I used to wrap around the glass. Now the advantage to this is it holds its shape, so I just wrapped it around the glass and I didn't need to secure it with any hot glue at all. Now I'm happy enough with this prototype that I'm going to make all of my little lanterns. And wouldn't it be nice if it had occurred to me to put a hole in the bottom of this one? I actually did put a hole in the bottom of the very first prototype that I made, because I want to insert lights in it. If I'm going to put it on a tree and I'm going to have lights on the tree, wouldn't it be cool if the little lantern lit up? So you can see that I've made myself a whole bunch of little flip-flop lantern bottoms, and what I'm going to do is just drill a hole, and I think I'm using a 1/4 inch drill bit here. It's the largest one I have in this little case, and I'm going to drill a hole in the bottom of all of these so that I can insert lights in, hopefully. And when I put the piece of craft foam at the bottom, I can just easily cut a hole out of the craft foam with scissors. I don't need the drill for that. And I was brave and I did also drill a hole in my prototype, and you can see how it looks with the light inserted. I think it's very successful. So once I had this process all figured out with this prototype, it was very easy to make a lot of little lamps in a sort of assembly line style here. Now, one of the main differences is that I really did want those little holes around the top. So I drilled little holes in those top pieces. But I will say, when I painted them, the holes got filled in. And so I ended up just painting the holes on. Even though there were holes there, you couldn't see them. So I just put a little dot of paint with a toothpick to make it look like there were holes. Now, very quickly, just in case you're thinking, I think that I want to make these out of Model Magic. Well, maybe you'll have more success than I did. But the very first one that I made out of my own homemade air dry clay, which would be similar to Model Magic. And maybe real Model Magic would work better. But you can see sort of the process I went through here, and it wasn't super successful. And I made a bunch of them too, and I threw them all away. So if you're wondering, or maybe you've guessed why I called this channel Crafts the Charm, yes, it is partly because I think making your own decor, making your own personal items is charming. It adds charm to a space. But it's also because I'm usually trying to make something that I've never seen anybody make before, at least not exactly the thing that I'm making. And sometimes it's several different tries, sometimes 3 tries, before I come up with something that works. So it's a sort of a, well, it's the third time the charm. And in this case, the first one was the terrible Model Magic ones that I threw away. The second one was made of the craft foam pieces, but the shape wasn't right and it was ugly. And the third one was when I finally really got a lantern that looked pretty much like a lantern, close enough from a distance. And then the fourth one included the hole in the bottom and the hook on top. Now, for the top of the new ones, I just made a hook and then filled in the top with hot glue, and that holds the hook in place. And here's what they look like on a tree with the lights inside them lit up. And then I thought you would also like to see what they look like not lit up so that you can see them a little better. So these little goats are made from mostly items in your kitchen, starting with the homemade air dry clay. Now, of course, you can use Model Magic if you want to, and I think they sell Model Magic at the Dollar Tree. You can get it a lot of places, but I like to make my own. It isn't exactly the same as Model Magic. It's a little bit, I want to say, softer. So you make this from baking soda, cornstarch, and water, and it's 2 parts baking soda to 1 part cornstarch and 1 part water. So here I'm using a cup of baking soda and a 1/2 cup of cornstarch and a 1/2 cup of water. And I apologize for the stove footage, but I just wanted to show you what it looks like as it's cooking. So you're going to cook that over medium heat and just keep stirring it. And it really doesn't take very long at all. I want to say 5 minutes before it starts to get quite thick. So pretty soon you basically just have a clump of clay, and then remove it from the heat, and it is going to be warm. You're going to want to knead it, but wait, of course, until it's cooled enough so that you can touch it. And then when you knead it, you can use a little bit of additional cornstarch if you need to. I didn't really need any additional cornstarch with this recipe. I have seen other recipes that have more water in them, but with this one, I didn't need additional cornstarch. So just knead that once you've gotten it out of the pan, and then you'll have some air dry clay that you can use. When you're not using the air dry clay, you can wrap it tightly in plastic wrap and maybe even store that in an additional plastic bag, although I don't think that I did that. And it'll keep for quite a while. Now, because air dry clay has a tendency to crack, what I did was I built a little goat armature that I plan to put the air dry clay over. So I have an example of one that I already built here, and then I'm going to create another one for you so you can see the process. Now for the armature, again, we've got some kitchen items here. I'm using mostly aluminum foil, but you could probably use something else like newspaper. I find aluminum foil works well because it's quite strong and stiff when you roll it up into a ball. And then I'm also using masking tape, and I'm using 22 gauge florist's wire. So basically, to begin, to make the little body, I roll the aluminum foil into 3 balls, a larger ball in the middle, and then equal-sized smaller balls for the front and the back, and tape that up. I made small balls for the neck and for the head, and I tried to get that fairly goat-shaped. I looked at pictures of goats. I don't know how successful I was. I did the best I could. And then for the little legs, I rolled up the tinfoil a little bit thinner and long enough so that I could tape it up to the body and then, tape those on. I don't think I did a very good job of getting that weird shape of the back leg of the goat. They have that odd sort of knee joint. And maybe you can do a better job than I could. I think I probably should have not even tried and just tried to make them straight, because one of my goats couldn't stand up. Not that they need to stand up, they're going to hang on a tree, but it would have been nice. Now, for the horns, I just doubled up that florist wire just to make it a little bit thicker, and then taped those to the head. Now, I also used a little bit of tape to sort of mark where I was going to put the ears and the tail. I'm not sure how necessary this was, and I just want to suggest some alternatives. When my goats were drying, one of the goats lost his ear, and I was able to easily just glue it back on. It wasn't a big deal, but the Model Magic isn't super strong, so the pieces do break off, and I'm talking about my own air dry clay, but I found that with the name brand Model Magic as well. It's just the nature of this stuff. So possibilities are, first of all, just not to put the tape ones on, because they just kind of get in the way when you're using the Model Magic, and just put them on using Model Magic and know that one might fall off and you might have to glue it back on. Or we're going to cover these with sort of a fake fur, so you could give it felt ears and a felt tail. So just some alternatives here. So once you have all of your armatures created for all of the goats that you're going to make, and I made 3, then you can cover that with the model magic. And this is maybe going to sound a little bit strange, but I tried to do this in a sort of anatomical way. So when I was a little girl, my parents had these drawing books, and sometimes I would get up early in the morning and I would try to do some drawings from these drawings books. I think they were called How to Draw. And my favorite one was the animals book. I think probably the still life wasn't that interesting to me, and the people were intimidating, but I really liked to draw animals. And the way that these books taught you to draw animals, you drew sort of ovals. So like if you were going to draw a goat, you would draw an oval for sort of the belly, and then ovals for those larger muscles for the legs in the front and the back, and oval for the neck and oval for the head, which is sort of how I built the armature. And it's also how I'm putting the air dry clay on. Now, maybe people don't draw that way anymore. Maybe you were never supposed to draw that way. But it does help me to draw something that looks a little bit more realistic. And I feel like with these goats, it did help me to create a body structure that felt like a little more real than I think if I had put it together in a different way. So I tried to put the clay on, around the belly, and then to do the sort of muscles of the legs, and then put the clay down the legs. I also used wire to create a wire hanger for the back of the goat and taped that down to the goat. Now I figured that probably where it would be the center of gravity for the goat would be closer to the head and not towards the back, because there's a lot of sort of mass up near the front of the goat. So it's basically right at the base of the neck, and that did seem to work out best for where to put the hanger. The goat that I'm modeling here, sort of, it's really going to be my own goat. It's only inspired by the Big Thunder Mountain goat. But the goat that's the animatronic goat that's at Disneyland in California, and I've never been to Disneyland. I've only seen pictures and videos of this goat, but it's very cute, and it has a stick of dynamite in its mouth. So I thought that that would be cuter than if I just made a regular goat like the goats that I have seen at Disney World. So for the head, I'm doing the lower jaw and the face and upper jaw separately and making the mouth open so that it can hold something that looks like a little stick of dynamite. And I have these little dowels that somebody gave to me, and this is the perfect application for them. They are different diameters. And the dowel that I ended up using was a 1/4 inch diameter. That seemed to look best for the size of goats that I'm making here. And then finally I fashioned the little tail and the little ears, and I put the clay over the little horns. And I had started to try to put in some facial features, and then they just looked creepy to me. So I figured rather than put in any indentations or anything, I would just paint them on. And my goats, well, I feel like one of them looks more like a little calf than like a goat. But hopefully with the horns and the dynamite in their mouths, they will look sufficiently like goats that it will be okay. And I hope that you are able to do better and make something that looks more like a goat. Now, I want to say, if you want to make a Big Thunder Mountain Railroad tree and you don't have time for all this, I'll bet that you can buy little plastic goats or something and then just paint a little dowel red and glue it to their face, and you've got yourself a little, Billy the goat from Big Thunder Mountain Railroad, and that would look just great. I wanted to try to make these basically from scratch, so that's what we're doing here. Now, you want to let those dry completely, so I would say at least 24 hours. I guess it depends probably on humidity, but just feel them and see if they've dried. They'll be pretty hard when they've dried. Now, even though I had put the air dry clay over an armature, it's still cracked on some of them in some places, and as I mentioned before, one of the ears came off. So what I did was I glued using hot glue, and I use a low temperature hot glue gun. I just glued the ear back on, and then where I felt like the cracks were very deep, I filled it in a little bit with hot glue. This really isn't going to show, but I didn't want any of it to come apart. So I thought, let's just start by gluing it together and keeping it as strong as possible at the base. So then with them glued and dry, what I did was gave them each a base coat of this paint, which is what I call my knockoff sheepskin paint. I had a nice folk art chalk paint, which was in the color sheepskin, and it dried up. So this is just acrylic paint. It's just apple barrel white acrylic paint, and I put in a drop of yellow acrylic paint, which I got at the Dollar Tree. And I feel like the color is a pretty good match for the sheepskin color. It's just basically an off-white. And in fact, it's so close to the color of this air dry clay that it's difficult for me to tell where I have painted these guys and where I haven't. But I did just want to give them a base coat. So these goats are going to be white and a sort of tan. Now, if you look at the goat that's at Disneyland, it is white and gray. And of course, you can do any goat that you want. These are your goats. I'm going to be putting some tan fur on it. So I want the skin, so to speak, underneath to match the color of the fur that I'm going to put on it, so that if you can see through the fur, you're seeing basically the same color. And I didn't really have gray, so that's why mine are tan. So with the sheepskin color base coat dry, I'm now going to paint on some features and paint where I'm going to put the tan fur on versus the white fur. So on my device, you can see I have a picture of, I think he's called Billy the Goat, from Disneyland. And I thought I would do roughly the same features for the face, so roughly the same white coming down the nose and down his chest. And I also wanted to look at just the way a goat nose and goat eyes look, at least according to Disney. So I started with some brown, and I think this is just my burnt umber paint. And I painted their little hooves, and I painted the nose, I painted around the mouth, I painted the eyes, and I painted the horns. So that's just a sort of a first coat with the brown. Then I mixed up a sort of grayish brown color, and I'm using a gray chalk paint from Folk Art, but I'm not positive which color that is. And I'm mixing that with my burnt umber. So this is because I only have chalk paint that's gray. I don't have any acrylic paint that's gray, and I liked that color basically, but you could of course use an acrylic paint or mix up your own gray or grayish brown. And I didn't paint all three goats exactly the same. I thought it would be fun to have a little bit of variation. So like two of them have gray tails, one of them has a white tail, and I did different things with the legs as well. But I just wanted to make them some combination of gray and white, and I didn't try to do any spots on them. You know, I've seen goats, they have little spots sometimes, but I thought I would try to keep it fairly simple. And then I painted the inside of their mouths with this top-notch paint in light peach. I think I got that at Joann's. And I just wanted to paint the inside of the mouth, you know, something that looks like inside of a mouth color. Now then, to add to their features, I took a little bit of black paint. Again, this is just apple barrel acrylic black paint. And I put black stripes on their horns. I added some black to the eyes and the nose, just little dots. And then I went in with the white, and I put a white stripe to make it look like it was a little bit dimensional on the horns. So I put white stripes, and then just like a little dot of white in the eye. Now, even though you're not really going to be able to see this paint job very much, I just didn't like how bright it was, so I made a wash of water and my burnt umber brown acrylic paint, and I washed over the horns with that and then wiped it off a bit. So I just wanted to dull that bright, this off-white a little bit, and then I decided that I wanted to do it on the fur too, so I also brushed that over the gray part of the bodies, and it really looked quite a bit better after I brushed the brown over it. And now, once the goats are painted, I have a coat of the non-glossy Mod Podge, the matte Mod Podge, and I just covered the goats with that to seal them, because we're going to be gluing onto these goats, and the glue will just pull the paint off of them if they're not sealed. Okay, so you might want to stop here, especially if you're good at painting and if yours are shaped better than mine, if they came out better than mine. This is very time-consuming, this next part, but I wanted my goats to be furry, and honestly they end up looking more like sheep than goats. I couldn't help it. I had to leave their fur a little bit long because I thought that they were cute. But anyway, the way I did this was I took yarn, and this is yarn from the Dollar Tree. This off-white color is Aran. That's the name of the color, but any off-white color that you like, of course, will work just fine. I wouldn't use the white, it's very, very white, it's very bright. Aran is the currently available off-white color that they have. And then for the brown parts, I used a color which is called grayish tweed. Yes, it's called grayish tweed. And I really love the color. I think the name is funny. Anyway, what you're going to do is you're going to cut a lot of little tiny pieces of yarn. And these are, I don't know, it looks like they're maybe ½ an inch. You want to make them long enough that you can glue them down to the goat. So part of them is going to be glued to the goat. But then what we're going to do is sort of fluff them up, untwist them, and then trim them. So the goat will have sort of some curly fur. Now most of the white ones that you cut are going to be short, but I wanted him to have longer fur just sort of on the chest, sort of like a little billy goat beard, but more on the chest than on the chin. And those I cut to maybe more like ½ an inch. I would say don't cut them too long because they are hard to untwist, and you're going to trim all of the yarn anyway. But basically what you are going to do is cut all these little pieces of yarn, and then you are going to glue them all over the goat's body. So try to glue them as close together as you can, and try to glue them so that as little of the yarn is glued down as possible. So you want it to stand straight up as much as possible from the goat. And again, I did this sort of anatomically, and with the legs, start at the bottom of the legs and work up. Same thing with sort of the torso, start at the bottom and work up so that the yarn is layered over itself. Now I used hot glue to do this, and I would put the yarn on and then I would press it in with scissors. I had to work fairly quickly. I think the most pieces of yarn I could put on at once turned out to be 3. Sometimes I could put on a little row, like if I was doing a large area on the side, and maybe put 4 pieces in if I was very quick. But it is a slow process. But we're crafting because we like to craft, right? And when you see how happy this little goat is with all of his fur, you'll know it was worth it. Okay, so I did this goat head to tail in white so that you could see the process. So obviously I have a lot more to do with the grayish tweed. But then what I did was I had this very large needle, it's like a rug needle, and I used that to untwist the yarn. So it's actually pretty easy with the shorter pieces of yarn. You just stick the needle in and pull it up, and as long as the yarn is well glued, it just fluffs the yarn up. Now some pieces of yarn are going to come out, especially if they just weren't glued down that well. But you see the basic idea. You just want to make sure you get every single piece of yarn, and this doesn't actually take that long. Gluing the yarn on takes a really long time, but fluffing it doesn't take very long at all. And then once you've got him all fluffy, then trim it so that you can see the shape of his body more or less. I couldn't bring myself to trim it really, really close because I just thought it was very cute with the sort of longer fur. Now, you may be looking at the pile of trimmed fur and thinking, hey, why don't we just glue that directly onto the goat? And maybe you can make that look okay. I actually, of course, did a little bit of a prototype before I decided how to do this, and I just had a little disc of the air dry clay, which I sealed, and then I did both techniques on it. I glued the pieces of yarn, fluffed them, and trimmed them, and then I took what I had trimmed off and glued it onto the sample, and that's the part on the bottom. So the part on the top is the goat, and the part on the bottom is the extra fluff, and I just didn't think it looked very good. But maybe you could do it better, or maybe you think it looks fine. I think other alternatives are maybe you could put felt on this guy, or of course there are different ways you could make it. You could sew it, you could felt it. Here's the grayish tweed now, and we're going to do the brown parts of the goat. And I'm not trying to bore you, I'm going to speed this up, but I did want you to see sort of the order in which I put the yarn on and how it looks as I do the yarn. Okay, so here's the goat fully yarned and partially fluffed and trimmed. and see how happy he is. So yeah, this was definitely worth the work. And then here he is after I've done some fluffing and trimming, and he definitely looks more sheepdog than goat. So turning to the sticks of dynamite, I have those 1/4 inch little pieces of dowel. So I'm just cutting them a little bit shorter, just cutting them to, it looks like about 1 inch, but whatever seemed like it was a good length for a stick of dynamite for these goats, you know, for the size of these goats. And I'm going to paint those red. So the paint that I have here is Craft Smart acrylic paint in Tuscan red. And I'm going to give those a coat of the Tuscan red, just cover the entire little piece of dowel, including the little ends. Now, with that dry, they look okay. We could probably use them this way, but I felt like this is a goat who stole some dynamite from a mine. It's probably a little dirty down there. And I wanted to dry brush a little bit of something that would look sort of like dirt onto them, or, you know, dust or whatever. Now I started with my burnt umber, and that just didn't look great. So I added a little bit of black acrylic paint to that, and then just dry brushed that over the sticks. Now we'll just seal those little dynamite sticks with some non-glossy, some matte Mod Podge. And finally, for the little sticks of dynamite, this is black florist wire that I had bought at the Dollar Tree. It's very thin, and I wanted to use that for the fuse for the dynamite. And I was able to just hot glue that to the end of a dynamite stick. I did bend over the end of each of the fuses, only because the wire is a little bit sharp. I think as an alternative, you could of course use a little bit of the black twine or a thick black thread. I wanted the wire because I wanted it to stand straight out from the little fake stick of dynamite, but I didn't want it to be sharp at the end, so I bent it over. I then just hot glued the dynamite sticks into the open mouths of the little goats. And here's how they look on the tree with the lanterns that we already made. Here they are with the lights off. And here's how they look with the lights on. The Big Thunder Mountain Train in Disneyland in California has a little area which is called Rainbow Ridge. It's the mining town that's associated with Big Thunder Mountain. So what I decided to do was make a building from that little mining town. And again, I've never been on that ride, but looking at pictures, I chose the Big Thunder Saloon. And I like this building. It's got a sort of rectangular facade, and then it has a little building behind it which looks like it's a sort of a log cabin. So to start, I just opened up Photoshop and planned out the facade. I knew that it would be easier if I had a template for cutting out the windows and the door, and also if I had a sort of a template for the lettering as well, because I knew that I would not be able to freehand the words on the front of the saloon. So the materials that I'm going to use to make this, besides of course paint and glue, are from the Dollar Tree, one of their little bird houses, and then some wood planks. Now these are the wood planks that are rectangular. There are 6 pieces in the package, and they are 7.1 by 2.8 inches. Some bamboo skewers, and small and large craft sticks. Now in the end, I did also end up using 2 Tumbling Tower blocks, but you could get around that with additional craft sticks if you wanted to. You don't have to include those. Now the first thing I did was I cut off the front of the roof on the birdhouse, and I have lost the footage of that, but I just used a little saw. I have a saw and miter box, which I will link in the description because it's been a very, very useful tool for this project and for other projects. So I did cut off the front of the roof, which overhangs in the front and the back, so that I could fit the facade flat up against the front. So I did also, of course, cut off the little perch on the birdhouse. And then I just cut off as much of the front of this birdhouse as I could without weakening it, because I do want light to be able to shine through the front of the facade. It wasn't easy for me to cut through I wasn't going to try to use any sort of power tools in this project because I was afraid that power tools would rip through this wood. So I am using a box cutter knife and the little saw for all of the cutting that I'm doing on this project. So with the little birdhouse flattened off and opened up, I then turned to the plank and I held it up against the birdhouse to decide about how high I wanted it to be, using a photo of the saloon from Disneyland, and I decided that I wanted it to be about 5 inches tall. The Big Thunder Saloon at Rainbow Ridge has some trim across the top of the building, and at first I didn't think that would be very easy to reproduce. Then I realized if I took a large popsicle stick or craft stick and a small one and a bamboo skewer, that I could put them together and create something that looks sort of like a crown molding. So what I did was I glued those together first, and then once they're one solid piece, then I will cut them. So you can see I glued them with the small piece not exactly lined up at the bottom with the larger piece, and then the bamboo skewer on top of the small piece, again leaving a little bit of space on the larger craft stick at the bottom. So you can just put it together in whatever way looks like nice crown molding to you. That was the configuration that I thought looked pretty good. So I had printed out 4 copies of my plan for this just because I wasn't sure how I would be using them, and I figured I would probably need more than one. And so what I did first was I just cut out the door and windows so that I had a template for cutting out of this piece of wood. And I just marked that on the piece of wood. And what I realized was this was going to be a lot easier if I cut it from the bottom. Now, if you don't want to cut it from the bottom, then you can drill a hole in this wood, and that will give you a starting place for cutting out the door and the window. So I would drill that hole right in the middle of the windows and the long part. And then you could cut from there, just like I did with the birdhouse. And the reason that it doesn't go all the way to the bottom, in the actual building, there's a sort of a little porch on the outside. I thought I would just put a step there. And if I'm going to put a step there, it's really okay if I cut all the way to the bottom and then just put the step in front of it. So you won't really be able to tell that you'd actually fall on your face if you tried to walk through the door because there's no floor there. So I am going to draw the lines all the way to the bottom and cut all the way to the bottom of this piece of wood, and that just makes it easier. This, again, like the birdhouse, this is not easy to cut, and I want this to be as neat as possible because this is the front of the building. Once I could use the knife to open up enough space for the saw to fit, it was much easier to cut because the saw works pretty well. But it was a challenge to get myself to that point. It went much quicker once I was able to cut with the saw. So to cut the trim for the top, I thought that I would have it wrap around the building, even though the building, or the facade rather, even though the facade is not very deep, I just thought it would look nicer if it wrapped around. So I did want to miter those edges. Now, the little miter box, it has a 45-degree angle that you can cut at. It has a straight up and down 90-degree angle, and then I'm going to call the other angle a 135-degree angle, and for reference, that 45-degree angle, I guess that's like a forward slash, and the 135-degree angle, I guess that's like a backslash, although I always get forward slash and backslash confused, but I think I have those right. So what you're going to do on the front piece of the facade, on the left side, miter it using the 45-degree cut, and on the right side, miter it using the 135-degree cut, and make sure that the inside is the length of the building, otherwise you might cut it too short. So the actual outside of the wood, the outside of the miters, is going to be larger than the size of the front, right? They're going to poke out a little bit, and that's where they're going to meet the other pieces of wood. When you cut the two little end pieces, on the left side, the left side piece, the left side of the left side piece is going to be straight. For the right side, you're going to miter it with the 135-degree angle. And on the little piece on the right side, the right of that piece is going to be straight, and on the left, miter it with the 45-degree cut. And then the little mitered pieces will fit together nicely against the miters on the front. I'm only explaining all that because I can be spatially a little clueless, and so it helps me to say it all out, and maybe it will help you not to make any mitering mistakes if you decide to make a little piece like this for the top of your little building. Of course, you could do straight cuts if you're more comfortable with that. I just like the way the mitered cuts look. Now then, the door and windows need trim, of course, and I didn't have any pieces of wood that were really thin enough for me to make trim, so I decided that I would use the bamboo skewer. I thought that they looked okay in the end, so I just cut lengths of those, and here I did not miter, although I think it would look better if you mitered. I had enough trouble just doing it straight, so I just cut pieces for the sides of the windows and pieces that went all the way up from the bottom, not the very bottom of the piece of wood, but the bottom where the step is going to be. So up from the bottom to the top of the windows. So that frames the door. And then I framed the windows between the door frame and the window frame on the side, and then I framed across the top. So when you're doing this, you only need to decide which pieces are going to be sort of on the outside. And if you just cut them one piece at a time and glue them on, then you should be just fine. Because the inside is not exactly square, because it was a challenge to cut, I really needed to measure each piece against the little building front and cut them each individually to get them to be the right size. And then once I had all the pieces cut, I laid them out on a piece of painter's tape to hold them in place until I can glue them to the piece of wood. And before I glue them, I want to sand the wood. It has a few rough spots from when I cut it. So I started with a 60 grit and then I went to a 120 grit. I just want it to be smoothed out enough that nobody gets hurt. After I wiped all of the sawdust off, I then glued everything together using Gorilla wood glue. You could certainly use hot glue for this, or possibly some other glue like E6000 or super glue, I don't know. I used wood glue because it's wood, but the disadvantage to wood glue is it does take a little bit of time to dry, so I did hold it together with painter's tape while it was drying. Now with that all glued together, what I decided to do was Mod Podge the words, the Big Thunder Saloon, onto the top of the building, between the windows and the molding at the top. Now I printed this in reverse because I'm going to Mod Podge transfer it, not Mod Podge it straight down. So I'm just going to use it again as a sort of a template so that I can paint over, because I know I can't freehand paint this neatly. So I'm just going to use regular matte Mod Podge and Mod Podge it upside down, which should reverse the letters back to being readable. And I'm not going to wait for that to dry like 24 hours, because again, I'm not really trying to make a nice transfer. In fact, I'm going to paint over it. So I just need it there so I can see the letters. I also used a little spackle and I filled in the little corners between the trim around the door and the windows, and I think I did a pretty good job with the miters at the top, but I also used a little spackle there as well. Now I plan to put wax paper behind the windows and the door as a sort of glazing, I guess, but mostly just to hide the birdhouse. And I also need to have some little swinging doors, and I thought the tops of those large popsicle sticks, they're not exactly the same shape as the swinging doors on the Big Thunder Saloon at Rainbow Ridge, but I thought they were close enough. So I just measured those to a size that seemed about right to me and cut them down. And I had to cut them widthwise as well, because they were a little too wide and they were going to show through the windows. So I wanted to cut them so that they would just meet in the middle and not show through the windows. And now I do want to be able to insert a tree light in the back of this to shine and make the saloon look very warm and welcoming. So I'm going to use a 1/2 inch bit here, and I'm going to drill a hole in the back, and that will be plenty big for inserting a small Christmas light. Now for the step in front of the door, what you have to account for here is there's a little ledge on the bottom of the birdhouse. And so what I want to do is to put a little step there that will sit on the ledge, and it needs to be below the trim for the door. Now, worst case scenario, if you didn't account for the ledge, you could always just cut the ledge off. But what I found was exactly the right size was one of the larger craft sticks, and then a tumbling tower block, which is this Jenga toy from the Dollar Tree, was the perfect size. I needed 1 plus a little bit of the tumbling tower block, so what I did was I cut 2 so that the seam would be down the middle. I just thought that would be neater than having the seam off to a side and using one whole block and a piece of another block. And now to paint. With this one, I was going to try to make it look sort of like the Big Thunder Saloon at Rainbow Ridge, which has a sort of a yellowish color on the facade, and again, it's like a log cabin in the back as far as I can tell. And I'm not too sure about the roof. I think it's brown. I'm going to say wood shingled. I don't know. So what I have here is my Deco Art Burnt Umber, which is a brown. I have a Dollar Tree brown paint, which has a little bit of a reddish color to it, and I have a black acrylic paint, apple barrel black acrylic paint. I also have a white paint, which I've got a tiny bit of Dollar Tree yellow mixed into, which I call my sheepskin knockoff paint. Now I start by painting everything except for the facade with the burnt umber brown. I then used the black acrylic paint, and I used a toothpick to give some features. So the separations between the logs for the log cabin, and then the shingles, and then the boards on the little step in front. I did switch from a toothpick to a fine paintbrush because I got frustrated with the toothpick, but the toothpick will definitely give you thinner lines. It's just you have to dip it in the paint an awful lot. I then added just sort of aging and knot holes, dirt, other features with the black paint. I then mixed up a gray wash with the white sheepskin and some black and some water, and I washed that over the steps and over the bottom, sort of the platform of the birdhouse, and wiped it off. And then I used that to add some features, sort of like where light would have made the wood look lighter, like light hitting it, I mean, to the roof and to the logs. Now for the facade, where I had Mod Podged on the words as a guide for myself, you use cool water when you remove the paper of a transfer with Mod Podge, so I used cool water to get the paper off of that. And then I tried to mix up a sort of a yellowish brown base color using my sheepskin white, a little bit more yellow, and some brown. I painted this over the front of the facade. And of course, because you will see some of the back of the facade, I painted the back and the sides as well. I then added more brown and sort of dragged some of the brown paint through that with a smaller paintbrush, just to give it a little bit of aging and make it a little more interesting. Now I painted over the lettering with a fine paintbrush and some black paint, and my original thought was that this would be the shadow of letters that would be painted in a sort of red. But I wasn't able to successfully paint over this, so I just left these letters as black. A more talented artist could probably do better with this, but I really had to sort of leave mine alone and say that's the best I can do right now, and that's what it looks like. Now for the trim, I mixed up a sort of a reddish brown, and I painted all of the trim and the little doors with this color. Well, really it's just the slats for the little doors. And then I mixed up a sort of a watery, more orangish color, and I washed that over the doors and over the facade, because I really wasn't that thrilled with the color of the facade. Now for the little sign, I had given it a sort of a shadow with the black, and then I painted with my off-white, my sheepskin color, for the sign itself, and I also added some highlights to the little doors with that. And then I also painted over that with brown on the little doors. I had trouble getting those doors looking the way I wanted. Now I painted around the sign with the brown. And then I used a toothpick to try to paint in some lettering on that, and that looked really terrible. So I put everything down and I walked away from this project, because sometimes you just have to walk away when something looks terrible and go, okay, I will fix that later. So what I did was I found another cool Western font, and the fonts that I use are the free Google fonts. So I found another cool one, and I printed out a sign, and I cut a piece of craft stick to go over where I had painted the sign, and I painted that brown and Mod Podged first, I think, and then painted brown around it as a edging and as the color of the wood. And then I just glued that over the badly painted sign, and everything looked much better. Now I felt the house was just looking too bright, so I painted over that with just a brown wash, so just that burnt umber paint and water. I did the same with the little doors, and I used some black too where I thought that would help with the slats. Now I just glued everything together. So I glued the little doors onto the facade, and then I glued it was several layers, 4 layers of wax paper behind the windows and the door of the facade. And then I glued the steps to the front of the facade and the facade to the birdhouse. Now it's almost done, but it needs a couple of little lanterns in the front. And the first thing that I tried, I'm not going to subject you to much of this, but I'll show you quickly what I tried, because I think it had potential to work well, but it did not. So you know those little metal things on the end of pencils that erasers go in? I'll bet they have a name, because everything has a name, but I don't know what it is. I thought that those would be cool for the top and the bottom of lanterns. So I cut them off of a couple of pencils where the erasers were completely worn down. But they're too big. They need to have a glass ball in the middle of them, so I needed to cut them into pieces. In fact, I cut them into 3 pieces because I cut the middle out because they were going to be too big. One of them was a very lightweight metal, and it was easy to work with, and the other one was almost impossible for me to cut. So I think if you found a lightweight one, you might have better luck if you wanted to try this. What I really liked about them is that they're not just flat, they have markings on them, so I thought they looked really cool. So unfortunately, when I was working with them, they got crushed, and I tried to make them round again. And then I also didn't have any clear beads, which I thought was the way to go here, but I had nothing like a clear bead. So what I tried to do was use hot glue as the clear bead, the glass ball in the lantern. And what I did was I filled them up with hot glue because the erasers had come out. And then I put hot glue on top of one of them, and this will form a ball, but it'll slowly squash itself. So what I did was I would quickly flip it upside down so that gravity would pull it down, but then when it looked like it was getting pulled down too far, I'd quickly flip it right side up, and I just kept doing that until I could see that the glue had hardened. And I got something that looked sort of like a ball, but it wasn't a nice big clear ball like you would prefer. And then I have the very thin black florist wire from the Dollar Tree, so that was pretty easy to wrap around. And I painted the pencil parts black. But really, they did not look very good. I couldn't bring myself to adhere them in any way to my little building. So here you can see how bad they look. And then I tried something else, and here's the new one. And you can see that looks better. So I am filming in another location here, so I am sorry for the quality of this, but I wanted you to see what I had done. I cut some pieces of black foam, just craft foam, and these are 3/4 of an inch long by 1/4 inch wide. And I just wound them up and glued them together, like a cinnamon roll, but not as delicious. And I went out and bought some glass beads, and I got those at Walmart, and they were 99 cents, and they were the perfect size. I actually brought the little bad lanterns with me to Walmart to see if I could find something. And I glued those between the little pieces of foam, and then, again, same thing with the black wire. I just wrapped it around so you get that little cage around the ball. I also wrapped it around the foam a little bit too, which did make the foam a little bit more interesting. It gave it, a little bit of character. Now, I've made a lot of decorations for my tree over the year out of cardboard. I think cardboard is a really great material. So I'm going to make another one of these, and another Big Thunder Saloon, but I'm going to make this one out of corrugated cardboard. So I have a cardboard box here, and I'm showing you the dimensions. So for the facade, I cut a piece that was 2 7/8 inches wide, and I thought that my building was about 5 inches, but I measured it, it's closer to 4 3/4. So the facade 4 3/4 inches tall. The windows are 2 1/4 inches down from the top of the facade, and they're a little less than 1 1/2 inches tall. The house sides are 1 5/6 inches at the bottom by 2 1/2 inches tall, and the house back is 2 1/6 inches wide. Now the part that's going to match up with the sides, of course, is 2 1/2 inches tall, but from the bottom of it to the point of the roof is 3 1/2 inches tall. And each roof piece is 2 1/4 inches square. Remember that the roof pieces are going to overhang front, not in the back, not in the front, and on the sides. Now, the way I put my roof pieces together one of them is on top of the other. So if you want to do that, you want to make that one just a tiny bit longer or the other one just a tiny bit shorter to account for that width. And of course, cardboard is much easier to work with. I just cut all the pieces out with a box cutter knife or with scissors. And I was able to cut out the door, of course, much more easily. Now, the other thing that's great about corrugated cardboard is it's corrugated, and that looks a little bit like a log cabin. So I did peel off on the sides and the back of the building. I peeled off that top layer of paper over the corrugated part of the cardboard to give us that nice texture. And now, really feeling wimpy about the letters, I just printed out the words. I printed out just a whole rectangle and just glued that right to the top of this. I wasn't going to try to transfer it because I'm not going to get this piece of cardboard wet. So I just glued that right to the top and then cut out where the doors, the door and the windows are. Now the cardboard isn't super strong, even though it's corrugated cardboard, like particularly those little areas between the door and the windows. So I did firm this up with some wood. I trimmed the whole thing with wood. This is easy wood to cut, so I feel like this really does save you a lot. Well, especially if you don't have the little pieces of wood or the little birdhouse, then you would have to make it out of something else. So this saves you those pieces of wood and working with those pieces of wood, and all you need to work with are the bamboo skewers, and if you want to, the craft sticks for making the trim at the top. But you don't have to. You could make that out of cardboard too. You can see it next to the building. I made the trim for the top out of wood. I happen to have made more than I needed, so I just cut it up and used it for the top of this building. And I used bamboo skewers to trim the front, and this made the front stronger. I also had an extra little piece of wood that I used for the sign for the front that goes under the Big Thunder Saloon sign. And that's it for wood. So the rest of it is cardboard. For the steps, I just cut 3 pieces of cardboard that I'm going to glue together for the step in the front. Oh, and I did cut a piece for the bottom. That wasn't in my measurements, but I basically just stuck the box on top of cardboard and just guessed at what size I wanted that to be. And to put this one together, I used hot glue, which is much quicker and easier. But I don't glue the whole thing together until I've painted it, because the facade is painted differently from the building. Another difference with this one is because the sides of the cardboard don't look that good, I did put a little bit of the bamboo skewer trim down the sides of the facade. And with the windows, I did regret that I hadn't put any mullions in the windows, but I felt like this could really only handle one across. When I thought about putting another one in to divide it into 4 panes, it really looked silly. So I think they would have to be really quite tiny for it to look any good. But I thought putting one across was an improvement from having just open windows. And oh, the little doors, they're also still the craft sticks, just like before. I thought I would paint this one in slightly different colors. So the building is still the burnt umber brown with sort of black accents. And the steps, or the step, I painted basically the same. But the front, I used my off-white and dragged some brown through it. And for the trim, I didn't put so much red in the trim. There's still, I think, a little bit of red, but it's mostly just a dark brown with a little bit of black and just a tiny bit of red. And I liked that color better. So I actually like the colors on this cardboard building better than the colors I used on the other one. And before I glued it all together, I did cut a little hole in the back so that I could put a light in the back of this building as well, and of course I did put the wax paper in it. I made little lights for this one as well, same as for the other one, with the craft foam and the glass beads. And for both of them, I glued the little lights to the front beside the door at the top. Now you could Mod Podge this whole thing to seal it. I didn't Mod Podge mine, but I probably should, so I might go back in there and Mod Podge them just to cover up that paint to seal it in. And here's what they look like on the tree, which already has our little lanterns and our little goats. And with the lights on and shining through, aren't they inviting? Don't you want to go in? And let's see, for the dancing and the poker. I'm going to start with my inspiration, which is this really cute sign that was at Disneyland when they closed the Big Thunder ride there. And it says, "Notice mine closed, mountain goat infestation, seeking miners with herding experience." I just thought that was really cute and funny. So I thought I'd like to make some signs for the tree, and I'd like to keep with the mountain goat theme. We have goats on the tree, so it makes sense. Now, I would say if you want to, take this sign. Just find an image of it on the internet and print it out, and then follow the rest of my process with this sign. I think it's adorable, but I wanted to make something that was somewhat original. I can't claim originality. It's based on this ride at Disney World and Disneyland, and it's based on this sign, but I thought I would try to make a couple of original signs to go on our tree. So I went to Wikimedia Commons and I did a search on goat line drawing because I wanted to imitate somewhat the style of the sign from Disneyland. And I'll just show you some of the images that came up that I thought were possibilities. What we want, or what I want, is to have as much of the goat as possible in the sign. I don't want anything in front of the goat. Unless I'm going to do a sign where there are multiple goats or goats and something else. So I hadn't really decided on the signs exactly at this point. There are a lot of weird images that aren't goats. A lot of cherubs. So those were some of the goats that I found. And the reason I like Wikimedia Commons is because quite often you can find images that are in the public domain, or you can find images with some sort of Creative Commons license so that you can use them freely. Now I also searched for an image of Dynamite because our goat has a stick of dynamite in his mouth. And strangely, the only search that I did where I got anything that was at least a reference photo of Dynamite was on explosive. Searches for dynamite and TNT and stick of dynamite didn't work, although I did get a diagram of the composition of a stick of dynamite. But I did find at least some reference photos, nothing I'll be able to use on the poster. And then I wanted to look for some examples of old-timey sort of posters, and a number of searches didn't work, but what seemed to work best for me was old newspaper advertisement. So I found a few that were really cute. The one that I decided to use is this one for William Polson and Company corn flour. So I grabbed that one and I brought it into Photoshop. And briefly, what I did was I used the clone stamp tool to take that background and used it to erase most of the image and all of the words here, except for, I think, the name of the printer at the bottom. Then I selected a goat image that I thought would work well and brought that in. And I worked with layers a little bit just so that the bottom of this goat is, I don't know if it's in the water, so I worked with layers a little bit so that that was sort of covered up by some of the decorative detail at the bottom of this image. I then did my best to erase the background around the goat. I'm not an artist, but I did my best to sketch in some dynamite in the goat's mouth. Now I used a font called Huët, which is a free font from Google for the word Dr. Charms. The idea for this sign is it's going to be some sort of goat repellent, but sort of in the style of a snake oil ad. So some sort of cure-all kind of ad, but this is a repellent to repel the goats because there's a goat infestation. Another ad that I looked at had this funny text at the bottom, medals awarded at all fairs wherever exhibited, and I loved that. So I just copied that text and put it in on my sign.
And for the rest of my text, I thought I'd claim that it's scientific because I think that's the sort of claim that was generally made in the 1800s, that it's guaranteed, and then I added a list of other things that it will repel besides goats. And then I tried to make the words look like they were sort of worn off by taking a color from the background and using a brush that's sort of looks like a scattering of bits, and just put that over all of the text and over the goat. And I also gave his dynamite some sparkle, because I think the dynamite that the goat is holding is lit at Disneyland, but I'm not positive, but that does make it funnier. Now, if you want to use my images, I'm including the image right here, and feel free to pause, take a screenshot, and use this image if you like it, or modify it if you want to, of course. You should feel free to use this other image that I created as well, or again, modify it. I thought a town meeting made sense. I thought that would be fun. A sign for a town meeting where we need to discuss the goat infestation. And this goat actually looks sort of like the goats that I made, in that it's super furry. So I made this sign as well. And again, please feel free to use it if you want to. So I'm just going to cut those out. I printed them out. They're about 3 by 5. For my tiny little tree that I'm setting up as my Big Thunder Mountain tree, the smaller sign is definitely a better size for the tree. The other sign, the town meeting sign, is a little bit larger, and I feel that it's a little too large. Now I'm going to use these craft sticks, and I have the larger size craft sticks here. And I need 9 of them for the larger sign. But we only need 7 for the smaller sign. So I'm just going to measure out a size that seems reasonable for each sign and mark the sticks and then cut them. And these sticks can be cut with scissors, or I have some shears here that I'm using to cut them, but you can cut them any way you like. It's just you really don't need to get fancy with a knife or a saw or anything. So once they're cut, I'm going to glue 2 more craft sticks to the back of each of them, and I'm using the larger craft sticks on the one that is made up of 9 pieces, and I'm using the smaller craft sticks on the one that's made up of 7 pieces. And I'm just gluing those to the back with wood glue. Now this surface, it's a card table and it's not flat, so after I glued them on, I moved this to a flat surface and I put something over the top that they wouldn't stick to, and then I put some heavy books on top while it dried. Now I actually tried a few different paints. I want this to look like old rough wood, and that's a little bit hard to do with the craft sticks. Now fortunately I had some older craft sticks and they had some sort of interesting color variation to them, and then I mixed the newer craft sticks in a way that I thought made sense. Like, you know how sometimes if you're replacing fence pieces, you often have to replace pieces that are near each other. So I put a few of them near each other and then one in another location. But I couldn't really find a way to rough them up so that it would be easy to dry brush over them and get some texture. And so after trying a few different colors and techniques, what I decided to do was to paint them this oatmeal color. And this is the Folk Art Home Decor Chalk Paint, and the color is oatmeal. And it's a sort of a greenish tan. It doesn't look like oatmeal to me. But I brushed it on, hopefully you can tell, kind of roughly. So I'm leaving some places unpainted, but it's mostly painted. That's on the front. On the back, I felt it wasn't quite as important, and it was slow and it was using a lot of paint. So I mixed some water in so that I could quickly paint the back of this. So the paint on the back is a little more filled in because it was wet, so it covered very well. But this chalk paint's quite dry, as I'm sure you know if you've ever worked with chalk paint. So it was easy to brush it on and leave some places unpainted. I then used my favorite brown Deco Art Americana Burnt Umber, and I really just dry brushed that over the top. And I also did a little bit of back and forth with the brush. And in doing that, I got a surprisingly woody looking paint on there. So I thought that worked really well. Now, of course, we're not even going to see most of this because we're going to be putting our poster over it. But I did this on both the front and the back. And on the back around the popsicle sticks, or the craft sticks, I put a little bit more of it, sort of as if it were dirty and dirt had gotten in the cracks around the piece of wood holding the other pieces of wood together. Because if it's on a tree, you might see the back of it. When you're taking it off and putting it on, you want it to look consistent. So I did paint both sides. Now I didn't like how clean and new my little posters looked, so I soaked them both with some water, just dabbing the water on, but I did get them thoroughly wet. And then I dried them with a blow dryer, holding them in my hand and just crinkling them a little bit, just to give them a little bit of texture and to age them a little bit. And the white one, the town meeting sign, I loved how it looked when it was wet. It got a sort of a gray color. So what I did was I took a little bit of gray acrylic paint, a light gray color. I believe the color is called Granite, and it's just an apple barrel acrylic paint. And I mixed that with water, and after I had dried it, I brushed that on and then just wiped it off with a paper towel wherever it was too heavy, just to give that a more aged look. Bright white just isn't going to work for these ornaments. Now, in placing them on the wood, I didn't want to place them exactly straight or exactly centered. So the goat repellent I placed a little bit down and to the right, and for the town meeting it's crooked, and I thought I would curl the edge over at the top as if it was coming off. And I just used Mod Podge first of all on the back of them to adhere them to the wood, and then over the top of them completely to seal them. And for the town meeting one where it's curled up, I put the Mod Podge on the back of that piece, the piece that's curled up and under it, so that it was completely covered with Mod Podge. And this is the non-glossy Mod Podge. This is the matte Mod Podge. And finally, to hang them, I just took a little bit of my 22 gauge florist's wire, although I'm sure lighter wire would be fine as well, and I made a little loop and twisted the end and hot glued that to the back. This isn't exactly to hang it on the tree, it's to put a hanger through to hang it on the tree. If I were making a loop for hanging on a tree, I would make a larger loop, but I have these sort of below the top, and I intend to put a hanger through them. And here they are on the tree. And again, I do think that the town meeting is a little large for this tiny tree, but I think it would look fine on a regular sized tree. Or I could shrink it down and make it the same size as the other one, or even smaller. They are a little large for ornaments. Now the Dollar Tree sells these faux succulents, which I think are great, and I especially liked these ones that were the dusty blue-green color. These are clips, and then one of these is not a clip, it's just a stem. And I thought those would look great in the tree. They're sort of reminiscent of the sort of bushes that you see on the Big Thunder ride. So I just put those in the tree, or clipped them to the tree as part of the tree decoration. And here's the tree with the lights on. Keeping with our Dynamite theme, I thought it would be fun to put dynamite on the tree. And you might be thinking, well, dynamite is not very festive, but Christmas crackers are festive. And so what we're going to do is we're going to make a Christmas cracker that looks like dynamite. Now I'm also going to do another variation, which is not a Christmas cracker. And of course you could just make ones that are simply decorative, that aren't anything at all, just looks like a piece of dynamite. But it makes sense to me to make something that's a Christmas cracker that looks like dynamite. It goes with our theme. Now, if you're not familiar with Christmas crackers, they're tubes. They're somewhere between 6 and 10 inches long, depending on the size of the cracker. I suppose they could be even smaller or larger. And they're wrapped and they're gathered at either end, and they're filled with prizes. So what you do is, usually like around a table, you cross your arms and take hold of the end of Christmas crackers on either side. So you and your neighbors on either side are holding the ends of Christmas cracker, and then you pull. And when you pull, they sort of explode because they have something inside them called a cracker snap or a bang strip, which makes a loud noise. And then out of the cracker will come, traditionally, a paper hat, a joke on a piece of paper, and some kind of little treat, some kind of little prize, toy, something. So we can make one, but if it's going to look like dynamite, it's not going to be gathered at both ends. So what I have here is a wrapping paper tube, and those are usually pretty abundant this time of year.
and I have a piece of cardboard. I'm cutting a 6-inch long piece off the wrapping paper tube. We're then going to cut circles out of the cardboard to fit just inside each end of the tube, and you want to make that as tight a fit as possible. Now I have this sheet of adhesive cork from the Dollar Tree, which I'm going to use to cover those circles that are going to go on either end of our stick of dynamite. You can use whatever you want. You might think it looks more authentic if it's white or black or red. I thought the cork would look pretty good. I think originally a piece of wood was used in the end of a stick of dynamite. I don't know what's used now. So I think the cork is going to look good. So I'm just going to cut a circle out of the cork and then adhere it to my piece of cardboard that's going to be inserted in the end. So it's going to be the same size as the piece of cardboard, and I'm going to cut 2 circles. Now for the Christmas cracker version of the dynamite, I really wanted something that would spray out at the end that would look like the dynamite was lit. And I went to the Dollar Tree because I thought this is a place we could all go to and find something. And this was the best thing that I could find. And unfortunately, I really wanted silver or gold, but they didn't have just silver or just gold. So I got this blue. And this is one of those things that I don't know if it's a little piece of cement, but it's meant to hold balloons, helium balloons. So the sprays that are in this are really stiff. They stand up really well. So that's why I selected this. And I figure that I can use about half of that, and then I'm going to cut it. So I could probably get 4 crackers out of this blue stuff. Oh, and I didn't want to cut it with my scissors because it's metallic. I don't know what it is. So I did use a knife to cut it. I then cut a hole in the top of my cork and cardboard circle, inserted the blue stuff in there, and then glued it down on the wrong side, the side that will be inside, with my hot glue. Now here's the wrapper that I'm going to put around the cardboard tube. And so I'm just showing you the image here so that you can take a screen grab and use it if you want to. It's pretty simple. It just says Big Thunder Explosive Powder in a serif font that I thought looked old-timey. And again, I've sort of gone over it with a brush in Photoshop to make it look like it's worn off. And I did take the explosive powder and I just tilted it just a little bit so that it looked like it was printed on separately from Big Thunder. So to me that just made it look a little more old-fashioned. Now my tube is 6 inches long, and then the diameter of it is about 2 inches. So if we multiply that by pi, we're going to get something over 6 inches for the length of this. So what I did was I cut it 7 inches long and then 6.5 inches wide so that I would have a little overlap on either end, and I'm going to tuck that in when I glue it to the tube. Before I do that though, I'm going to paint it, and I'm going to use my Craftsmart Tuscan Red acrylic mixed with a little bit of my favorite brown paint, the Deco Art Americana Burnt Umber. And that's actually easier, the whole thing, to paint onto the paper if you add a little bit of water as well. So I started by just painting with the paint as it was, and then I added a little bit of water. And of course we want this to look like an old messy stick of dynamite, so it really doesn't matter if the paint's thicker in some places and then watered down in others. We just want it to look like an old stick of dynamite, so messier is better. And I did try to paint it a little bit lightly over the words so that we would be able to see the words. Once that dried, I dry brushed some of the brown over it just to make it look a little bit dirty. I think I did something similar for the goat's little sticks of dynamite too. Now I just used Mod Podge to adhere that to the tube, and then again, as I mentioned, I put a little bit of Mod Podge at the top and bottom on the inside of the tube and just folded the edges of that paper down inside. So you want to get it centered in the paper so that you've got a little bit on either edge that you can fold in. Now the cracker snaps are quite long, much longer than my tube, and you can see in the middle where the pieces each have a little bit of explosive powder on them, and they're up against each other, and then there's something wrapped around them. That's the part that's going to make the bang. So that's the important part of the cracker. So what I'm going to do is adhere the right side to the top of the dynamite, and then we'll stick the top in, and then we'll take the bottom of it and adhere that closer to the bottom of the dynamite, but inside the tube. So I'm going to be trimming this. I'm going to trim it at the top and then I'm going to trim it down at the bottom so it fits inside the tube, and so that it's stuck firmly inside and to the top. So if we pull the top off, we'll get our snap. And we're going to fill it from the bottom. You might be able to tell from the way that I adhere it that I've had problems with cracker snaps in the past. I've had problems with them not exploding, and I've had problems with them just coming out, like not being held tightly enough at one end or the other. So I use both hot glue and duct tape to hold this down. Once the cracker snap is adhered well on the inside, then we can fill this up, and then we can put the bottom on. So I just wanted to show you examples of the sort of thing that you can put inside. I like to customize Christmas crackers when I make them for people, so I usually put in some things that I know that the person I'm giving it to will like. But here is a standard paper hat, and I also have some candy. So you want small individually wrapped pieces of candy, because when you pull it they might go flying out, so you definitely want them wrapped. I often use lint truffles. And then here's a little pin from Disney World. It's a Big Thunder Mountain Railroad pin. Disney pins are actually really nice for Christmas crackers. Obviously, if the people you're giving the cracker to like Disney pins. I'm going to put a link in the description box to a place where you can buy cracker snaps and little hats and the little prizes that you typically put inside a cracker. It was a long time before I could find a place in the United States where I could buy cracker snaps, so I was really excited to find this company. Now you could make this to be a one-time cracker. Traditional Christmas crackers are destroyed once you use them. Or you could try to make this reusable. This can be reusable because we're just going to pull the top out of the cracker and it's going to snap. And then we would be able to remove those pieces of the cracker snap and put a new one in if we could get the bottom off. So you could glue the bottom on with hot glue, or you could tape it. What I'm going to do here is cut some holes and use a little bit of this black florist wire that you can get at the Dollar Tree. So I'll cut holes in my circle for the bottom, and I'll just cut little slits in the side of the tube, and then I'll just tie it up and then tuck that wire inside, because we don't want wire sticking out. But that way we'll be able to open it up and get at the workings inside once we've used the cracker. And here's what this looks like on the tree. It is a little large for our tiny tree, and if I were making simply decorative ones, I'd make them much smaller. But because this is a Christmas cracker and it has to have space for prizes inside, I made this larger one. And when you pull it, you can see what happens to the snap. It breaks at that point where the explosive powder is, and that's when it makes the bang. I do want to note that that could be frightening to children and dogs, other little pets. And I want to show you an alternative which does not have a cracker snap inside, but also isn't plain. You could, of course, make a plain one. You don't have to put anything inside at all. But this one's got a little bit of electronic components in it, and I will put some links in the description to some of these components. So what I'm going to use is an LED light, and you will need a 3-volt battery to power an LED light. And I actually saw some 3-volt batteries in the checkout at the Dollar Tree today, so it's pretty easy to get these, but you want to make sure it's 3 volts because a 1.5 volt isn't enough. So you can see the 3 volts there a little bit larger. And I also bought these little battery holder, coin button battery holders. I'm not sure exactly what they're called. I'm giving you the words on the description, and I will include a link to that. And I liked these because it has an on-off switch. So what we're going to do is connect the LED light to the leads on the battery holder and put the battery in it. And then we would be able to turn that on and off, and that will look like a little light at the end of our dynamite. Now, if it were flickering, yes, that would be much better. This is just going to be a nice little glow. Now, you can just tape the LED to the battery. That will also work just fine. But the problem with that is that it would always be on, and eventually you would use up your battery. Whereas if you have an on-off switch, you can turn it off when you're not using it. So that's the advantage here. So let's look at the battery case. So you put it negative terminal down. And if you look inside the battery case and you sort of follow that little negative terminal with your eyes, you'll be able to tell which of the 2 wires is the negative one and which one is the positive one. And that matters because the longer leg of the LED needs to be attached to the positive wire. So you just want to make sure you're attaching it the right way, obviously, so that it lights up. If you put it the wrong way, you might burn out the LED. So that's why you want to follow it with your eyes and make sure you're going to touch it to the correct wire. Now, if you have a soldering iron, obviously that's the best way to attach the LED to these wire leads. I wanted to show you that you can do this without a soldering iron, so that's how I'm going to do it here. Here's how you can do it without using a soldering iron. So I'm going to cut off 2 small pieces of electrical tape and put them down. And then I'm going to wrap the positive wire around the longer leg of my LED. And I'm going to wrap the negative wire around the shorter leg of my LED. And I'm going to lay each of those down on one of the pieces of tape. I'm going to do this while it's switched on, because I need to know that the connection is good while I'm doing this. So as long as my LED is lit up, I'm doing fine. And this did take me a couple of tries. It's definitely better to solder it if you can solder it. But once I have the wires wrapped around and it's sticking to the electrical tape, if everything's still lit up and it's still working, then I put a little hot glue over each of those connections, so where the wire is wrapped around the leg of the LED. Once the hot glue has cooled, then wrap the tape around that hot glue in the connection. Again, as long as we're still all lit up, we're good. And then take the tape and wrap each leg of the LED completely, because those legs can't touch each other, or you might short out the LED. Once we've gotten to that point, I cut a hole in the middle of the top of my stick of dynamite, and I created a new top for this one, but it's the same stick of dynamite from before. And then I just insert the LED from the bottom through that hole, so the LED is sticking up. And then I cut a slit next to that, and this time I actually had some silver wiry stuff. It's like a ribbon, but it's, you know, it's for a present, but it's very, very stiff. And I cut that to make a sort of a spray, and I put that next to the LED. And then I just insert the battery pack into the stick and then push the top in. And when you want to turn it off, you can use the spray of silvery stuff to pull it out, or you can sort of poke it, the top, so that it pushes in, and then you're able to pull the whole top off, and then you can turn it off. So it's quite easy to turn off and on by just removing that circle at the top. And here's how it looks on the tree. I really like this one. I wanted to start with some inspiration photos. I looked at a lot of photos of Big Thunder Mountain Railroad rides when I was creating the ornaments for this tree. And for the box, for the bottom, for the crate, I looked at a lot of photos and I considered a lot of different structures on the Big Thunder Mountain ride. One thing I really loved was this wagon, this sort of turquoise colored wagon in this photo, but I didn't want to deal with wagon wheels on our box. I think that could look really cute, but it would have meant either making wheels or buying wheels, and I didn't want to do that. Now in this photo, you can see a number of structures and crates, and what I settled on was a crate sort of like the one in the lower left. So I want to construct a crate that looks like that one, with the frame, with the boards that are going diagonally sort of behind the frame. Now I considered, as always, using pallet wood. I do love pallet wood, and I think that's a really great option, and it's basically free. But I'm making a crate for a really small tree, and I also thought it would be a good idea to see if I could use materials that are available to everybody and see if I could paint them to look like this old pallet wood. So what I settled on is these paint stirrers that you can get in the paint department at Home Depot. And you can get 3 21-inch paint stirrers for $1.50, or you can get 10 12-inch paint stirrers for $1.50. So I thought that was a pretty good price. So I'm only going to make the 4 sides. I want mine to be rectangular in shape, and what I decided is for the size of my tree, The rectangle on the front and on the back are going to be 10 inches wide by 8 inches high, or roughly. And the rectangles on the side are actually going to be more like 8 by 8 squares, roughly. So what I needed was 2 of the 21-inch paint stirrers per side, and I could get the top pieces and the side pieces out of 2 per side. So I used those for the frame of each box, and then for the diagonal pieces I used the 12-inch pieces, and I was able to use one set of 10 for almost 2 sides. So I'd say you probably want to have 3 sets of 10 of those. And now these pieces have a ruler printed on one side, so they do have a right side and a wrong side, so you do want to be mindful of that. Now the advantage to the ruler, of course, is that I didn't need to mark them for my first cut. So what I did was I cut 10 inches off of each of the 2 longer 21-inch paint stirrers that I had. And I did that outside on my radial arm saw. Now I didn't measure the smaller pieces here because of course the radial arm saw is going to take a little bit out of the wood, so I needed to wait until I made the cuts. But the pieces that go between the 10-inch pieces are going to be closer to like 5.5 inches. I don't remember the exact measurement, but the width of these is more than an inch. Okay, so here are the pieces cut. So the 10-inch pieces are the top and bottom, and then the 5.5 plus pieces go between those, and then we're going to put our diagonal pieces. So I just fit as many of those as I could before I started cutting them, and then I figured I would be able to use part of the end of them along the corners where it's shorter. Now to cut these, I cut them 3 different ways, so there are a lot of options for you here. I do have this little tiny miter box and saw, and it is possible to cut with that, but it does take a little bit of time, and I didn't want to ruin that little saw by cutting these paint sticks with it. So I did switch to my Stanley miter box, which I've had for a long time. I think it's a pretty common miter box, and I'm cutting 45-degree angles here. And of course the paint sticks, they have that sort of curvy part at the end. I'm trying to avoid that. We could get a lot more out of them if they didn't have that, and I do end up using that on the sides, you'll see. But for now, I'm cutting the pieces and starting with the longer pieces and laying them down, and again making sure I'm cutting on the right side or cutting on the wrong side depending on which way you're laying them out. And what I recommend is that you cut them pretty far away from the edge of the frame. I did that in some places, and in other places I didn't, and then I was sorry when it came to attaching them. I had in my mind an idea about how I was going to attach them, and then I changed my mind, and it caused some problems near the end. So I would say make it nice and neat all the way around, cut it as far away from the edges of your frame as you can to make your life easier when you go to join these pieces together. Oh, and the final way I cut these is I did cut some of them on the radial arm saw because I was cutting other wood anyway when I did the side pieces, but you really run a danger of splintering your wood when you cut that way. At least I do. I don't know if I'm doing something wrong, but with this wood I found the best way to cut it was with this hand saw and the Stanley miter box. Okay, and once I had all those pieces cut, I numbered them because I'm not really that good at spatial puzzles like this, so I wanted to make sure I knew which piece went where. And then I used wood glue, I have Gorilla wood glue here, to glue the frame together. And I really should clamp this, but I don't have the right kind of clamp to clamp it together. I really need to invest in some clamps. So you'll laugh, but what I did was I actually just moved over to the television, sat down and watched some TV, and held it together, because it's small enough that I could do that, while I watched a TV show. Now once that was dry, I glued all of the slats on as well, and again just using the wood glue, and I glued them on the back, and of course with the right sides facing out, and then sort of flipped it over carefully to wipe the glue off, because we are going to paint this the glue is going to make it a little more difficult to paint. So we want to make sure we clean that glue off, and I just wipe that off with a little water on a paper towel. And then for this, I put a clear mat on top of it that won't stick to it, and I used some heavy books to hold that down while it dried. So thank you to Halliday, Resnick, and Grossman for your big heavy books. Okay, so I didn't think you needed to watch me make another one of those. That's a front or back. I think it ends up being the back, actually. I made another one just like that, so 10 by roughly 8 for the front. I measured it against that so that they would be exactly the same. And then again, I made basically 8 by 8 squares, so I brought those pieces outside and cut them. So I'm showing you this because I decided to reuse as much of the paint sticks as I could on the sides. So I am using those ends with the little depressions, which means that there are going to be holes in the sides. And I just tried to position those so that they were in different locations on the side so that it didn't look too weird. Like I tried not to put them next to each other. But I think I only used 2 new pieces on the side, and I was able to use a lot of the little extra pieces, and that's just because I don't like waste, so I wanted to use up as much of that as I could. Once the crate sides were all assembled, it was time to choose a paint color, and I always find this difficult. I tried some different paints on some of the leftover pieces of star stick, including some blue and turquoise, like that wagon that I loved so much. But ultimately I decided I'd try to match the piece of palette wood that I have. So I started with a gray wash. I'm using this Apple Barrel Granite Gray acrylic and mixing that with water. And I'm just washing that over the entire surface of each side and washing it, and then shortly after washing it, wiping it off. So painting a few pieces of wood and then wiping, and of course always painting with the grain of the wood. So I painted the front, and I painted the edges, so the outside and the inside, and once that had dried, I painted the back of all of the pieces because you will see the back a little bit. It'll be on the inside of the crate, and there's a chance that some of that will be visible when we're all done. Now the next thing I'm going to do is go in with my Deco Art Americana Burnt Umber Brown, and I'm going to give the wood some texture, some rot, and some dirt. So remember on the end pieces, the square pieces, I used the ends of the stir stick, so the parts that had the little arcs cut out of them, the notches cut out of them, so there are little holes. And what I did with the burnt umber paint is I used it pretty much straight to emphasize those holes and to give them some shape so that they don't look, quite so smooth and symmetrical. And then I dry brushed with the paint over all of the wood, again in the direction of the grain, and I did some a little bit darker, most of it pretty light. Then I went over, and here's where I did sort of the wear and the dirt. I did the edges of all of the pieces, and I really think most importantly, I did the inside where the larger pieces, the frame pieces, meet the slats. So I really did those inside edges and coming up onto the slats on the inside, and I sort of brushed it inward just so it looked like it was a little bit dirty in the places where I think grime would naturally accumulate on a box that was built this way. My final step painting these pieces was to wash over them with a wash made from the burnt umber paint and some water. And I washed over each piece of wood in the direction of the grain, but I did leave some places unpainted. So I let some of the gray stay, but I did paint most of the wood brown with this wash. So you'll still be able to see some of the gray through it, and you will definitely be able to see the grime and where we've dry brushed with the brown through it. And here's my piece of palette wood, and I think I did a reasonable job of matching the colors in the palette wood on our box sides. Now I think our crate is a little bit plain, and I'd like to stamp some words on it, like the crate in the reference photo. I don't have a Cricut, so I'm going to make a stencil by hand. So what I've done is I've used the Stencil STD font and written Big Thunder in 60 point. That seems to be a good size for this size crate. And Mining Company in 40 point. And I'm really not sure why I didn't choose shorter words like Mine Co. or something. I was regretting that at this point. So I printed that, and I used a spray adhesive to adhere it to some cardstock because I don't want to run cardstock through my printer. I'm afraid of breaking my printer. I'm sure a glue stick would work too, but I don't have a glue stick. They always seem to dry out. And so this process is quite simple, if not tedious and time-consuming. I'm just going to use a fresh blade in my X-Acto knife and cut out each piece of the stencil, just very slowly and carefully. And of course the reason I chose the stencil font is because it allows me to cut it out and leave, like the holes in the B and the D. The way the stencil font is, there's white spaces, so it's like a regular stencil. So what I decided to do was cut out Big Thunder first and make sure this was going to work, because I really don't stencil very often at all, and so I didn't know if I would be any good at it. So I didn't want to cut out the entire thing and then find out that this wasn't going to work. So I cut out Big Thunder, and that wasn't too bad. So then I decided I would do a test, and I decided to do that on the back of one of the crate faces because I wanted to do it on the same wood so that I would have the same sort of texture. Like if I did it on a piece of paper, I wouldn't be stenciling on the same texture as I'm ultimately going to stencil on, so it might be different. So what I'm using is just some black acrylic paint and a stenciling brush, and I got some paint on the brush, and then I tapped it on some paper to get most of the paint off, and then I tapped it or dabbed it over the stencil, and it seemed to work. So I cut out the stencil so that it would fit on my crate front, and then I just did the same thing, got some paint on the brush, got some of it off, most of it off, and then held the stencil down and very slowly and carefully tapped that over the stencil, and it worked. So I cut out the smaller stencil, and I tested again just because it is a smaller stencil, and I just wanted to make sure that there were no differences, and it also worked just fine. So I did have this originally at a little bit of an angle, but I have cut the pieces out separately now, so I put it at, I think, a little bit more of an angle than I originally had it, because I just wanted it to look a little rushed and sloppy. They're just spray painting, or maybe not spray painting it if it's the Old West, but painting, stenciling these words on these crates probably as fast as they can. It's not important that they look good, it's important that the crate gets to the right place. So I did angle that a little bit. Now, to finish off this crate, I don't want to permanently attach the sides to each other because this is a seasonal decoration, and what am I going to do with this little crate most of the year? So I thought it would be much easier to store if I just had these mostly flat faces that I could stack together and stick on a shelf or in a box or something. So I'm using these tumbling tower blocks, and I don't know if this was the best approach. This is just what I decided to do. I think if you wanted to assemble it, I would just use these blocks and put glue on the two sides. You stick them in the corners, maybe use 8 of them, two in each corner, top and bottom, and then just glue to the faces. But what I decided to do was glue 2 to the sides on each side, so 4 to the side, and then 1 to each face sort of in the middle of that, and then just use those as something that I could tape together with duct tape and then untape when I don't want to have this in a box shape any longer. So I have put something down on the table. It's actually the back of a hard mat placemat, or the underside of a hard mat placemat, so that I have a level surface, because this card table is not level at all. It's got some sort of divot in the middle of it. It's bowed. And obviously if I'm going to put this together, I want it to be flat on the bottom and the top. And I just glued those blocks, roughly where I thought they should go. And here's where I got into trouble, because I hadn't been neat with my slat pieces. Some of them were in the way when I went to attach my third blocks, my blocks to the front and back faces. So I had to sort of try to cut those back, and I cut them with my little saw, and then I had to try to sort of pry them up because wood glue is very strong. So that's why I say just be really careful when you put them on to begin with, to leave a lot of space around the edges. It would have been completely possible just to use 4 blocks, and I wouldn't have had to worry about where those slats were. And that's what I was originally thinking, which is why I didn't worry too much. I just made sure that the corners were free. And then I decided I really didn't want this to be a permanent box in my house. You also don't have to use these tumbling tower blocks, which are a little long. I would think just a little wood cube would be fine. Dollar Tree does sell little wood cubes. They also sell larger wood cubes. Or you could use whatever wood you have around the house, or buy some wood at a home improvement store. There's lots of different options for wood. This is just what I had handy. So once I had all of my tumbling tower pieces glued on, I just tried to square it up, and then I just, again, as I mentioned, used duct tape to tape the inside of this box together. And now to finish it, of course, we're going to put it around the bottom of the tree, or I'm going to put it down and then I'm going to drop the tree into it. It's not a box, but it's like a frame that'll sit around the base of our tree. And I thought it would be fun if it looked like a crate that we had just opened, and it had some straw in it. So what I'm going to do is stuff it mostly with all of these plastic bags, because I always have a lot of plastic bags in the house, and then use one of these Dollar Tree grass hula skirts to act as the straw. Now finally we need a topper for the tree, and I thought about making a lot of different things, but I just couldn't make something because this windmill was so perfect. I just had to use it. There is a windmill like this on at least one of the Big Thunder Mountain rides, and it's roughly star-shaped, so it just seemed perfect for the top of the tree. Now I bought, and this is from Dollar Tree, I bought one that says welcome at the bottom, and as you know, it can be somewhat difficult to pry these signs apart, but I used a knife to sort of slice at the glue, and when you do that, then it becomes a lot easier to pry pieces apart. So I just removed that welcome part from the bottom, and I'm afraid it's so mangled I don't know if I'll be able to reuse it in another project, but we'll see. Maybe I can straighten it out. And then I just took a little bit of florist wire, and honestly I don't even know if this is necessary because I have had this on the tree. That's where I've been keeping it up until now, and I can just sort of stick the top of the tree. It is an artificial tree, which makes it easier. I can stick the top of the tree between the blades of the fan and that triangular metal piece on the back. But what I'm going to do is just take one piece of florist wire and make sort of a loop across that triangle at the back, and then I can slide the top of the tree between the triangle and the loop that I've made. And that works just fine. I would think you could also buy an inexpensive tree topper, like one at the Dollar Tree, and take off the sort of spirally part, if it's that sort of tree topper, or it looks sort of like a spring, and attach that here if you need something a little bit stronger. And so here's what the crate looks like, stuffed with the bags and then with the hula skirt at the top, and I've put my larger stick of dynamite in there that is the LED stick, so sort of the candle stick, and I have the smaller sticks of dynamite on the tree and the topper.
So what did you think of our Big Thunder Mountain themed tree? Did you have a favorite craft? Please tell me in the comments. I think that one of my favorites is, of course, the little goats. They're so cute. But I also really liked the dynamite crackers and the little crate that I made for the bottom of the tree. If you liked this video, please give it a thumbs up. And if you enjoy this sort of content, please subscribe to Crafts the Charm. Thank you for spending time with me today. Take care.